Everybody, this is Mr. Marshall at Stony Lane, and today I'm coming to you with a topic that I love, and I think it's a topic that I think we all need to think about if we're working with children who are learning a lot. And the topic is vocabulary. If you're anything like I am, when you were a child, you probably had vocabulary quizzes and vocabulary tests that kind of went like this. You probably had to learn 10 or 15 or 20 words and be able to supply their definition or use them in context on a test. And then, depending on who you are, you may or may not have remembered some of them, maybe all of them if you're one of the rare few people that worked for. But for most people, taking a test that way teaches teaches you to remember something for what's called your short-term memory for a task like a test. Okay, instead of having it in your long-term memory for something that you can use for the rest of your life. And really, whenever we teach anything, don't we want kids to learn it for the rest of their life? We want them to have it so that they can use it. And in the case of vocabulary, it would be to use when they read and write and when they speak and when they listen so that they can convey what they're trying to say for real. So today we're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary in school and vocabulary at home. And so let's get started. So if you had the experience that I had with studying words for a vocabulary test, it might even have left you with sort of a negative taste in your mouth. But let's kind of look at vocabulary a little bit differently. As many of you know, my family speaks Hungarian at home. And in Hungarian, the word for vocabulary is szókincs. Szókincs. And szókincs is actually a compound word that comes from two smaller words. It comes from the word szó, which is the Hungarian word for word, and the word kincs, which comes from the Hungarian word for treasure. And when you put those two ideas together of word treasure, it's a treasure of words. It's something that's so much more beautiful and positive and something that everybody wants. So let's try to think of vocabulary as szókincs, as something that's positive, something that's a treasure that we want our kids to develop all through their lives. So let's take a look at that. So linguists have something that they call 3 tiers of vocabulary that teachers think about when they're teaching their students, and that you can think about when you have your children at home. Tier 1 is everyday words. Those are words that everyone uses in a very common way, right? They're ordinary words that mean ordinary things around our houses, and just very ordinary words. Like we say things like sofa, right? We say things like chair. We say things like kitchen. Words that are around us and that everyone can really learn just by hearing it, from their childhood, or if they're a second language learner, hearing it just in everyday conversation. And most of our kids are pretty secure in tier 1 vocabulary in their native language. Okay. And if your child is an emergent bilingual child, meaning that they learned another language and they're just beginning to learn English, then they will be secure in their tier 1 vocabulary in their native language. And then later on, they'll learn to be secure in tier 1 vocabulary in English as well. Okay. It just comes from hearing stuff. Okay. Tier 2 is more sophisticated words. Okay. So tier 2 is extraordinary words for ordinary concepts. So instead of saying the word sofa, you might know the word divan. Or you might, instead of saying sidewalk, you might call it a curb. It's a little bit more specific sometimes, but it's always a word that we hear less often. So it's just a fancier word for a topic that you might be talking about all the time. Instead of saying glasses, you might say spectacles. Okay. And so that's what tier 2 vocabulary means. Tier 2 usually comes from being a reader or a writer in a language, because that's where you're exposed to more tier 2 vocabulary. Now, you can also support your child in developing from tier 1 to tier 2 usage by integrating words like that into your speaking at home, right? And so think about that. What are some more fancy words for very ordinary topics that you might just be talking about around the house? Okay, try to weave those into your speaking and your child will start to pick up on those. Okay, so that's a way to help grow your child's vocabulary from tier one to tier two. Okay, and that doesn't mean that tier one is bad and tier two is good. We want kids to have both, but we need to expose them a little bit more explicitly to tier two. We need to expose them kind of consciously on purpose in order for them to grow into tier two. Tier three vocabulary are what's called domain specific words. Those are words that we don't use in everyday conversation unless we're talking about a very specific topic. So, for example, if you are talking about the rainforest, you're going to use words like canopy or taper, or words that only come up when you're talking about the rainforest. Sometimes we call tier three vocabulary, we call that jargon. It's about a very specific field or a very specific topic that you might be studying or that you might be working in. So, those are the three tiers of vocabulary, and it's important for children to have exposure to all three. All right, let's go on. Other things to think about. We want to think about things like the intensity of synonyms. Sometimes we want kids to learn synonyms, which are words that mean the same thing or about the same thing, but we want to really expose them to ways that they can know how intense a synonym is. So, for example, the word happy has lots of different synonyms, um, but there's a difference between being content, it's okay, or being overjoyed, right? And so we want to think about the context in which we use the word, right? So it's not raining today. Actually, it is raining today. But if it weren't raining today, I might just be content. I might be glad, but I'm probably not ecstatic that it's not raining, right? So sometimes what we do is we think of, if you ever go to Home Depot or a hardware store, you might see those paint sample cards that have a very light purple and a darker purple and an even darker purple and a very dark purple. It's kind of like that. How happy is the person in the situation, or how nice is the person? And so the context is really important for us to think about. We don't want to just use synonyms just to use synonyms. We want to really have intention about what we're trying to say. Okay. Another thing to think about with vocabulary is, how do words work in a sentence? Because sometimes a word can be a noun, or it can be a verb, or it can be an adjective, depending on how we use it in a sentence. So it's important to think about that, not to overteach it, but just to notice that. Like, sometimes you can say that to your child. You can say, I just noticed that this word sounds the same, but it's being used differently here. It's just something that you can mention, right? It's just an interesting thing that kids might start to notice when they're a little bit older, and it's a great thing to talk about. Okay, that words in a sentence sometimes change their meaning or their usage based on what they're doing in the sentence. It's also really cool to talk about origins of words. Where do words come from? They come from other languages sometimes, or come from they come from what they mean, right? Sometimes they're a compound word, two smaller words that are put together, and sometimes, if you look at the word up closely, it can help you learn the definition, right? Thinking about the parts of the word, and sometimes the origin of the word, like snowman. Well, it's a man that's made of snow, right? And if we speak English, we can kind of get that. And sometimes we try to think about other types of origins from other languages, like biology is the study of life, and a biography is someone's life written down, because bio means life. But kids who speak just English wouldn't know that. But it's something that we can talk about, and kids can get excited about that if they have enough experience with language to understand that. The next thing is multilingualism, and when you speak more than one language, some people worry that if I speak to my child in my other language at home, that's going to hold them back when in school. And in most cases, in 90 something percent of the cases, it's actually the opposite. Knowing more than one language actually helps your child to learn in school in English. Okay, and it sounds kind of strange because you think it's like two competing languages, but it's really not, because there's a part of our brain that is just about language. And if you can learn to think in terms of how you use the English language versus how you use another language like Spanish or Korean or even Hungarian, you learn to play by two different sets of rules. Okay, and it makes your brain a lot more flexible to learning a third language or learning other things. So, and multilingualism is something that can also help because sometimes words in one language are very similar to words in English, and so knowing more than one language is definitely an advantage. Approximation, sometimes we hear kids saying words and using them wrong, but they're experimenting with them, especially when they've been exposed to tier two vocabulary. They might be using the word, but kind of not using it exactly the way that it's meant to be used, and that's okay. It's okay. And if your child is very young, then don't correct it, but kind of model the correct way to use it, and then eventually they'll get there. If they're older and you feel like, oh, this is a word they really ought to know, then it's okay to mention it without making it feel like they're in trouble. Okay, so approximation is just a part of how we learn. It's how we learn to drive and to swim and to play games. It's how we learn to cook. It's how we learn how to talk and read and write. Approximation is just a big part of how people learn stuff. um, Wordplay, it's great to engage your child in play with words, any way that you can, like riddles or puns or hangman or anything that you can do to play with words is going to help them learn the words, but also feel excited about using the words. Okay, and excited about learning new things about words. So, those are a couple of quick pointers that I can share with you on ways that you can support your child in his or her development of vocabulary and language. And if your child has a really solid vocabulary, then they're going to have a lot of power to express exactly what they're trying to say and understand what the world is saying back to them. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you soon.